Hello, ngHouston. So I'm really sorry about the technical difficulties. We had some issues with YouTube, but that was my fault. And we got it all sorted. So we're ready to rock and roll today and jump right in. I want to introduce the panelists first. Javi, you want to say hello? Javi is a first-time panelist, but he's been around ngHouston for a long time. We really like him. So we're really happy to have you. Javi, say hello.
Hello.
And you actually are now a brand new Houston transplant. You just moved to Houston from, where did you move from?
From Monterrey, Mexico.
And when did you officially arrive in Houston? Like yesterday?
Yeah, yesterday.
Welcome to Houston. It's great to have you here. Javi and I just found out we're basically neighbors because Houston is a big, huge, sprawling city and we're not that far away from each other. So we're going to have to get together and do lunch one of these days.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. And our other panelist, you guys probably all know Jesse Sanders. Jesse Sanders, say hello.
Hi. And hey, I'm a first-time panelist on ngHouston as well. I've spoken.
Yeah, but you're pretty much famous.
Oh, come on. Oh, my gosh.
Dialing in straight from the Bat Cave.
Yeah, right. We got our new sound booth here. I'm loving it. And I do need to work on the lighting. And thanks to Otto here, I've got some great ideas on how I can do a better job on that.
Yeah, we were waiting for everybody to switch over from the old channel, and then we were having a chat about, because Otto has this fabulous natural-looking light in his office, and
we're all jealous. We're all very jealous.
We aspire. We want to be like you when we grow up, Otto. So I have to introduce Otto. Otto, say hello and tell us a little bit about yourself. We know you, but not everybody does. So say hi.
Cool. Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining the call today and working with us through the technical difficulties. My name is Otto Kukic. I work as a developer evangelist for Auth0. And today we're going to be talking all about Angular authentication, really, and share some best practices. And since Valentine's Day is coming up, I thought we would do a cool Valentine's Day type demo.
I love it. I think it's really clever. And yeah, Valentine's Day is tomorrow, so that's perfect. And you work at Auth0 with some good friends of mine, and I really like your whole team. So we have to give a shout out to Kim and Sam and anybody else we need to shout out to at Auth0.
Thank you. Yeah, they are amazing. One of the best companies to work for and one of the best teams I've ever worked with.
Yeah. They are super fun. Okay, so you have some authentication stuff to show us. Do you want to just jump right in? You have slides you want to share?
Yeah, let's do it. So I'm going to jump right in. If you guys have any questions throughout the stream, feel free to send them, and Bonnie will just interrupt me and stop me, and we'll go through those live.
So, and remember, beginners are okay. So it's okay if you ask us beginner level questions because it's ngHouston and we love beginners. So it's a safe space here.
Absolutely. So let's jump in.
Okay.
Boom. Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So let's talk about Angular authentication. And I titled this talk, this very brief intro, A Tale of Two Grants. And you'll see why in a minute. But just kind of reiterate, my name is Otto Kukic. I work as a dev evangelist for Auth0. If you do have any questions, please send them in that chat channel, or if you want to follow me on Twitter at Kukicado, I'll be happy to follow up with you there as well. So what we're going to be talking about today is Angular authentication with OAuth. And for those of you guys that might not be familiar with what OAuth 2.0 is, you might have heard the term if you've done any sort of social login or any type of federation, and it can be kind of a confusing term. And if we look at the definition, and I'll just read it really quickly here, it's an open standard for access delegation commonly used as a way for internet users to grant websites or applications access to their information on other websites, but without giving them the passwords. Now, that is a mouthful and really kind of a messy definition, but it's really what it does. So I thought I would just simplify this a little bit and help us understand it, a bit clearer and without, all the extra words. So let's just think, you can think of OAuth 2 as an open standard for access delegation. And so the reason we talk about OAuth as a standard for access delegation is because the authentication piece is built on top of OAuth. So you have to have OAuth 2.0 first before you can have authentication. And it's kind of one of those, chicken, who came first, the chicken or the egg? In this case, OAuth came first, but it doesn't have anything to do with authentication, which to a lot of beginners and even to, kind of identity veterans, it's kind of like, that's kind of confusing. But anyway, so that's OAuth 2.0. Now, when it comes to dealing with authentication, we have a different protocol, a different standard called OpenID Connect, or OIDC. And the way we define OIDC is an authentication layer built on top of OAuth, allowing clients to verify the identity of an end user based on the authentication performed by an authorization server. So really, OpenID Connect lives on top of OAuth, and it gives us the protocols, the definitions, and kind of the general guidance on how do we implement authentication for different types of applications, whether it's traditional web apps or single-page applications like Angular. And so in this talk, we're going to look at how OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect work with an Angular application. Now, to kind of help us visualize and conceptualize how this works, we're going to look at one example of how we authenticate within a single page application called the OAuth implicit grant flow. And to show you, conceptually in slides how this works, we'll just run through it quickly, and then we'll jump into our demo and actually show it in practice and go over all the different nuances. So to establish our baseline, or to kind of establish how we would have a single page application, an Angular application, without any sort of identity layer built on top of it, we would have our application on the right-hand side, which is our single page application. It lives entirely in the browser. It's a public client, so anybody can navigate to our application at myapp.com and see all of the code in it. So in this scenario, we can't really have any sort of private information in there, like client secrets or data that we wouldn't want to be publicly available, because even if we do, obfuscate it, or if we try to kind of hide it in the code somewhere, a malicious actor with enough time and dedication can easily, decode your code, work through all the little functions, and get the secret data. So when it comes to Angular applications living in the browser, we can't have private data inside of it. That's why on the left-hand side, we have our API that controls our business data, our private data, our client secrets, anything that we would want to authenticate a user before we giving them access. And typically the way that this works is our Angular application, using the amazing HTTP client library, will make a request to our backend API saying, hey, I would like resources for the user profile page or for the shopping cart. And our API server is going to look at that request, decide whether to process it or not. If you require elevated access, make sure that you're logged in. Once the backend server is happy with your data, with the request, and decides that it can't fulfill it and it can't serve it, it's going to send you back a response. And this is typically done in JSON format, although you could use any other format like XML, but why would you? So you make a HTTP request to the backend server, and on the front end side, you get HTTP responses back with JSON data. From that point on, your Angular application looks at that JSON, decides which components to load, how to present the UI, and what functionality to give you from that point on. When it comes to authentication, and especially when it comes to authenticating single-page applications, we're going to introduce this concept of an authorization or an authentication server or authorization server. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to log in and authenticate our user, give them an identity, but we're going to do this on a separate domain. And in our example here, we're going to be using Auth0 to kind of facilitate the identity process, but this can be any OAuth compatible identity server. It could be something that you built yourself. It could be using an open source library like Passport.js to give you the authentication endpoints. It could be, AWS Cognito or any other third-party service. But basically, we're going to have this concept of a centralized login page. And the best way to kind of visualize this and to think about this is when you're logging into your Gmail account. So when you go to gmail.com or youtube.com and hit the login page, you don't provide your credentials within Gmail or within YouTube or Drive. You actually get redirected to accounts.google.com. You provide your credentials there. You put in your username and password, or if you're logged in already and have multiple accounts, you choose from one of the accounts, and you're authenticated there. And then what Google does is they redirect you back to Gmail or YouTube or Drive or Fi or any of their other properties, send you the credentials that you need for that application, and then you're authenticated, you're logged in, and you have access to everything. So this is going to work very much the same in our Angular application. The first thing we're going to do is when we click within our Angular application on the login or sign in button, we're going to be redirected to our application on Auth0, where we're going to provide our credentials. And how we log in isn't really that important. So we can log in via social login. We can log in with the username and password. If we have any type of enterprise federation, we can sign in with single sign-on. But what we're going to do is provide our credentials, authenticate. The authorization server is going to verify our credentials, make sure that we are who we say we are, our password's correct. We've proved our identity. And at this point, what the authorization server is going to do is it's going to make a callback to our single page application, to our Angular app, saying, okay, Otto, you are logged in. Here is your ID token that shows your user's identity, who they are. And here is an access token if you requested one. And the access token is going to be used for accessing protected resources, so talking to the API. So this is where that whole concept of an ID token versus access token comes about. ID tokens are used within your application, within your Angular application, to manage your user information. Access tokens, on the other hand, are used to talk to the API and access protected resources. So now that we are authenticated and logged in our browser, we have our access token and our ID token. Now, our ID token, again, isn't going to give us any elevated permissions, any elevated access. All it's going to do is give us our user profile information so that we can display it within our single page application. So in the header, for example, we might show the user's name or their email, their avatar, and other profile information. But the access token, we're going to use that to verify to our API that we are authenticated and that we should have permissions to access a protected resource. So when we go to our API and say, hey, get me my account page, or get me, I would like to check out from this store, alongside that HTTP request, we're also going to append our access token in the format of basically in the header, in the authorization property. We're going to attach the token, and we're going to prefix it with the word bearer. So, we're going to have authorization, bearer, and then that token. And that access token, it can be a JSON web token, which we'll see what it looks like in a little bit, but it could also be an opaque string that's just a random number of characters, numbers that, mean something to the API server, but doesn't mean anything to the Angular application. When we make this request, our backend server is going to look at that access token, make sure it is still valid, it's not expired, and it does give you the permission to access the resource that you're trying to access. And if it's all good, it's going to send you back the JSON that you requested. And if for whatever reason your access token might be expired, it might now give you the permission to access that specific resource. In that scenario, the authorization, your API is going to respond back saying, hey, it's going to come back with a 401 or a 403 saying, hey, you're unauthorized, or, access to this specific resource is forbidden because you're a regular user and this API requires admin level access or something like that. Now, at this point, one of the most popular questions I get is, where do you store these ID and access tokens in your single page application, in your Angular application? And a lot of times, we want to store them and persist them in the browser so that we can, give the user a really good experience, so that they're not logged out after they refresh the page. And so that, our Angular application acts exactly as a regular traditional web application would. And for a long time, what a lot of companies did and what a lot of companies still do is store the ID token and the access token in a persistent data store like a cookie or local storage or session storage. And this is actually an anti-pattern and something that you should never do. And the reason for that is if you store the access token in local storage, for example, then all of your JavaScript has kind of free reign to talk to that local storage API, using the web storage API, and get the contents of that token. And I don't know about you guys, but I import a lot of npm packages when building Angular applications, and very rarely do I go through the code and make sure that everything is good, and that kind of validate that all of that code that I'm pulling in from npm is valid and doesn't have any type of malicious scripts that will kind of go to my local storage and steal my data, my tokens, and stuff like that. So for that reason, it's not recommended to put to persist your access tokens within local storage. But and if you did need to store them, then storing them just in memory in your in your global object once you're authenticated is acceptable. And the reason for this is if you refresh the page or access it from a different tab or a different browser, you're automatically going to be logged out because those tokens no longer exist in that session. But if we were to do that, then our users would have the crappy experience of, hey, I'm logged in and now I refresh the page for whatever reason, and now I'm logged out and I have to log in again. And if you had to do that every single time, you would have a really crappy experience, and Angular wouldn't be where it is today, super popular and powerful. So how do we get around that and ensure that we can still give the users a really good experience? The answer is silent authentication. And the way that this works is when we initially initiate our authentication request to the authorization server, we click the login button, we get redirected and say, hey, I want to log in. After we're authenticated and we've proven our identity, before we get those access and ID tokens sent to our Angular application, what the authorization server is going to do is it's going to set a session ID cookie or a session cookie on the authorization server domain. So on accounts.google.com, it's going to set a cookie saying, okay, this user's logged in. Here's this session that kind of identifies them. And then it's going to give you your tokens that you requested. So now you have your tokens. You can make the requests. You get the responses. Since you have the access token, everything's great. When you refresh the page or open it up in a new browser tab, by default, you are logged out. You no longer have access to those access tokens and ID tokens. They no longer exist. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk to the authentication server and check for the existence of that cookie. Now, we can share cookies cross-domain, so just having that cookie on the authorization domain doesn't really do much for our Angular application, because by default, we can share cookies cross-domain, and our Angular application here doesn't know that we have this cookie on our different domain. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up an iframe within our Angular application. We're going to generate this iframe that's going to point to our authorization server, and it's going to say, it's going to just load a blank page on the authorization server domain. And all it's going to do is it's going to check for the existence of that cookie. And once we hit this in an iframe, it's going to make a backend request to our authorization server. It's going to say, to validate that session. So to validate that this cookie is still active, it's still valid. And if it is, then the authorization server is going to say, okay, you are logged in, you have this valid cookie. I'm just going to send you back I'm going to generate new access tokens and new ID tokens and send them to your application. And it's going to do this via the iframe again. So once we get these in our Angular application, we're going to use the post message API to get the data from our iframe and push it into the mainframe, into our Angular application, where we're going to consume them and have them again so that we can make protected calls to our backend APIs. And the reason we do this in an iframe is because the authorization server endpoint that we hit has to be able to render some UI elements, has to be able to control and have access to the cookies. So a simple, HTTP request to the authorization server isn't going to suffice. By doing this iframe is going to allow us to get new access tokens without, and usually this takes less than half a second, and it's totally transparent to the user. The user isn't even aware that we opened up this iframe, got these access tokens, and pushed them up through the mainframe. So the user doesn't see any flickering, any UI changes. All they see is once they refresh the page or open it up in a new tab, that they're still logged in and they can continue to make these requests and responses, and everything works great. So that is the implicit grand flow for single page applications. And this is the flow that we've been using for 5, 6, maybe even 10 years, and companies are still using it. They're going to continue using this for the foreseeable future. But the OAuth and OpenID working group did come up with a new best current practice for single page applications due to the fact that our modern browsers have a lot more features. Like we can do crypto in our browsers now, which makes it a lot easier and gives us a lot more flexibility to implement some of the other more secure flows. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit with single page application with authorization code with Pixie Flow. But for right now, I think I talked enough and showed a bunch of slides. Let's go into the code and actually see how this works. And let me open it up to any questions so far to the panelists before we dive into the code.
I have a question, but I'm not sure if it's just kind of a hypothetical question, but I don't want to pull you off of the demo that you have. But it kind of, your single silent authentication thing made me think, because there's something that I was talking to a client about where they have form validation, like their new account name has to be unique, right? Because they don't want, because they use that as a unique identifier than the account name. But then they don't want, we want to do validation, but then we don't want to have security problems because we don't want to tell anybody like this already exists. So then I was thinking maybe that silent authentication concept would work for something like for validation as well. But that might be a completely separate presentation.
It could be, yeah. We can talk about it and see how we could work with unique identifiers. And
do you think that, just for my brain, we'll take it offline, do you think that silent authentication concept would work in that other situation? We don't want to give out information, but we want to have that.
Right. So that's always a unique case. And so, I've seen this a lot with like when you go to a new website and you try to sign up and it asks you for like a username, right? Yeah. Or if you try to reset an account and, you put in an email address and you get a message saying, if you have an account or if this email account, if this email address is registered to an account, you're going to get an email to reset your password. So they're trying to kind of obfuscate and not tell you that, this account is valid or not. But if you were to go and try to register with this specific email address, then it's going to block you because, if it exists in the system, you're going to get an error saying, okay, this email is already registered. So you kind of try to obfuscate it on the reset password flow, but on the sign up flow, if that email address or if that account ID exists, you're going to get an error in the application. So it's kind of you're trying to hide it and you're trying to not make it publicly available that, this ID or this user account exists or doesn't exist in the system. But to give the user the ability to sign up, and if they try to sign up with that ID, you're going to either get an error or the account's going to be created. So it doesn't really protect you all that much against a malicious user.
Yeah. That's a good point. Okay, so but I'm going off on a tangent. I'm sorry.
Okay, cool.
You just got me thinking when you started talking about that silent authentication. I was like, oh, hey, maybe that'll work for this other problem.
Yep.
Blame you, Otto.
So I've got a question for you, Otto.
Sure.
Actually, a couple of questions, but we'll start with this one. When I do, let's say I authenticate with Facebook or Google, and what's the identifying information that comes back? And the reason I ask this is that, a lot of times I'll use I'll go ahead and do this through a site, and then I'm like, well, which one did I use? Did I use my Facebook one to authenticate with, or did I use my Google account to authenticate, or did I use Twitter? What sort of identifying information is coming back, so that if it's, as an application developer, I can make sure that I properly identify that user, and that even though it's 3 different accounts, it would actually point back to the same account every time.
Yep. So usually the most minimal amount of information you'll get from any social connection flow, whether it's like Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, any of those, is you'll get a user's email address, and
Okay.
so that's usually good enough. Where if you log in with Google and then you log in with Facebook, and your Facebook login uses the same email address as your Google address, then we can kind of match that up and figure out that, hey, this might be the same account, and merge them. So Auth0, as a product, supports account linking. So if you're logging in from multiple different providers, and we see that your email address is the same, we can kick off a flow that helps you merge those accounts, so you just have one login and one identity. You're also usually, from any social connection, you're going to get their unique identifier, which might be the GUID, or it might be some type of super unique identifier to that platform, but they're going to be different for every social network. So that's not going to help you that much. Email address is usually the one that you automatically get by the user using the social login. And usually the best indicator. And there's other ones where you can get like the full name, or the family name, given name, but those can kind of be faked. But the email address is usually a really good indicator.
Okay. The other question, I'm just going to kind of lob up a softball for you here. For those that haven't used Auth0 yet, why would you pick Auth0 over, let's say, something like Passport.js?
Sure.
Good question.
So one of the reasons might be that so Jared Hansen, the creator of Passport.js, actually is a principal architect at Auth0. The other reason is that Auth0 has a bunch of different SDKs for any type of application you're building. So whether it's Angular, Node, Java, ASP.NET, we have SDKs that really make the user experience super, super simple, and it doesn't require you to understand any of these flows. You just call our method to log in, to authorize, or to merge the accounts, or whatever you're trying to do, and a lot of magic happens on the back end with these flows. So we're fully standards compliant with OAuth, OpenID Connect, and all of JSON Web Tokens, and a bunch of other standards and certifications, so that if you use Auth0 for it's super easy. But then down the line, if you decide that, hey, Auth0 isn't meeting my needs, I want to change my identity provider, you can do it in a way where you don't have to re-architect your entire system, because everything is built on open standards. Once you export your users out onto your own platform, or a different provider, all you have to do is change those method calls in your application to the new SDK, and it all just works.
All right. One last question here. I promise I won't hog up all your time. But the other one, and then this is probably another little lob up for you, but there's a lot of buzz right now around Nest.js and how much power that we have with this, and built on top of Node and Express. What kind of integrations does Auth0 have right now with Nest to make it super simple to use that?
So since Nest is built on Node.js, you can use our Node.js SDKs to implement it fairly simply. And I believe we might have a blog article or two already showing you how to do it. So I'll take a look after the call and try to find a resource, a blog post on our blog that shows you how to do it, and I'll be happy to share it with the group. So if Nest is kind of the hot up and coming framework, and it would be we want to make it easy to integrate login with that as well. So I'll find that resource and I'll share it.
Excellent.
Cool. All right. So Javi, did you have any questions, or should we get into the code?
I think we can get into the code.
Awesome. Sweet. So I have built a very simple Angular application called an Angular Valentine because it's one day before Valentine's Day. And if you don't want to order flowers and you want to send your special someone an Angular application, because that's the hot thing in 2019, I'm going to publish this code later today, and you can steal it and say that you made it yourself.
I think that we should tag Uri Shaked in this because he is like the nerdiest romantic that I've seen, and he used code to propose to his girlfriend.
Nice.
Because that's how much of a nerd he is, and she accepted because that's how much of a nerd she is, and they're both adorable. So I'm gonna have to send them a link to this video, so he's not the only romantic nerd out there.
That's awesome. So let's look at, so let's jump into VS Code really quickly and just kind of do a brief overview of our application. There really isn't a lot at the moment. So we have our app module, which if you have ever worked with Angular, and since this is an Angular meetup, I'll assume that you have at least a basic understanding and you have used the CLI in the past to generate an app. So I'm not going to go over all of the intricacies of setting up a module or the code, but we can take a look at it very briefly. So our app.module just imports a couple of different components: our main app component, a home component, and a callback component that's going to handle our authentication redirect.
Hey, Otto, for us more senior developers, could you make that just a little bit bigger? There
Absolutely.
we go. Excellent. Thank you.
And just a little bit. Move this guy down. Awesome. Can you? Oh, let's see.
That looks great. That's much more readable. Thank you.
Sweet. So our app component, all it does is it doesn't have any. Well, it does have a little bit of HTML that just shows our login button if you are authenticated, a logout button if you're not authenticated, and loads our router outlet. So it loads all of the other components, mainly just the home component for now. And if we look at our app component TypeScript, all we're doing here is whenever the application is loaded, we call this handle login callback method that is going to run every time we refresh the page. And what this method does is it looks for a hash fragment that's going to have our ID token and access token if we're authenticated. If we don't have those, then this function just kind of short circuits and doesn't do anything. And the other item we do is ngOnInit. This is our get access token method. And what this method is going to do is if you are logged in, if you are authenticated, it's going to go ahead and renew our access token and ID token. So it's going to go ahead and get us those new tokens when we refresh the page and we're still authenticated. So let's take a brief look at our auth service to just kind of understand all of the players there, and then we'll get into writing some code. So at the beginning, we instantiate our Auth0 account. So we just give it our client ID, our domain, where we want to be redirected back to, and our scope, which tells us what information we want to get back from the authorization server. And if we look at our environment here, for the scopes, we have OpenID, profile, and email. So what this is going to do is once we're authenticated, it's going to give us back the basic user profile information, their name, avatar, and then also their email address. So once we let Auth0 know who we are, who our client ID is, then we have the login method, and all this is going to do is just call the authorize method, which is going to kick off that redirect flow, which is going to redirect us to your account. So like accounts.google.com, where you're going to provide your credentials. We already talked about that handle login callback, the callback that comes back. We process that URL fragment and make sure that the user's logged in. We call the get user info method, which is going to decode the ID token and only the ID token to get the access information for that user. Getting the access token is kind of renewing that session, kicking off that silent authentication. User info is going to go back to Auth0 and say, hey, I have this access token. Can you please give me the user's profile information there? Oh, sorry about that. Get the user's access, get the user's profile information. And then the set session, what it's going to do is add all of the user's profile information, their access token in memory. So we're going to be able to access the user's access token if we want to send it to an API from our Angular application, but it's not going to be stored anywhere in the browser. It's not going to be persisted. Finally, we have our logout method, which is just going to go back to auth0 and say, hey, destroy that session ID on the authorization server because this user is no longer logged in. And then finally, we have a isLoggedIn method that we're going to use within our Angular components to determine if this user is logged in, and if they're not, show the logout button. So let's see how this works here in our application. We just have the login button right now because we're not authenticated. So I'll click login. And now I'm redirected to this domain, autobot.auth0.com. And I have a number of different options for authenticating. So I can log in with Google, I can log in with GitHub, log in with Facebook, or just log in with the username and password connection. And all of these are configured in your Auth0 dashboard. So if you go under connections here, you have a number of different database connections. So if you want your users to log in with username and password or email and password, you can set those up here, manage any password policies or anything like that. Social connections allow you to try different or enable different social connections. So we have Google, Facebook, and GitHub activated. But if we also wanted to give our users the ability to log in with, say their Twitter account, all we have to do is, what are we doing? Maybe not Twitter. Let's say LinkedIn. And okay, so for LinkedIn, you need an API key. For these other ones, oh no, you can just enable it. So one of the cool things that Auth0 does is for a lot of these social providers, you can actually enable it and try it out without going to LinkedIn or Facebook developers and providing your, getting an API key and then putting it back in. We give you a set of development keys for Google, Facebook, GitHub, all of these networks so that you can try it and see if it works and if it's something you want to use. And if it is, great. But if you don't want to use it, then you don't have to go and create another account to get the keys.
Hold on, Otto. You're saying Auth0 will set all that up for me so that I don't have to go and set up accounts to use each one of these services?
Yep. So for development purposes, we'll do it for you. But
that's so great.
Yep, so that you can test it out. But once you actually go into production, it's recommended that you do get your own key. So this is really good for quickly prototyping and making sure that it is something you want to add before committing to creating that account, getting the keys. And another and another good thing is for any of the social providers, once you are ready, we show you how to get your app ID in secret. And then from here, you can choose which permissions you want. So by default, you'll get the public data. Like Jesse was asking, what's the minimum amount of information you need? So that public profile will get you the email, the some identifying user information. But you can also ask for other permissions like getting the user's birthday, their access to their posts, ads management, et cetera, et cetera. So you can kind of customize this without having to understand how the Graph API works or how the Twitter API works. Everything's kind of done for you, and you just check the box on features you care about, and everything else you can just ignore. So now, before I log in, I'll just go back, click login again, and now you'll see that I also have the login with LinkedIn option now because I enabled it. And if I go and disable it, I won't see it anymore. But for right now, let's just go ahead and log in with GitHub, for example.
Which by the way, Otto, like for the developers that haven't done this before and haven't had to slog through like the Facebook APIs and try to figure all this out on their own, this is a huge time saver, especially when we're starting out a brand new application.
Yep, definitely.
And that's why I was getting so excited because I've done this before and it's so much easier the way you're showing us. Like this is much. I wrote a lot of code when I was trying to do this.
Right.
Especially Facebook and the Google. So much setup and boilerplate to get it all working, and it's just you're just showing us like this is super simple.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. Now, just a quick question. Now, if I have an application that's in production, I can still use in my dev environment the other APIs, or do I need to have different sets of keys for each one?
So you can There's a couple different ways you can do it. You can set it up here where you use the developer APIs. One thing we recommend is if you are going to have multiple staging environments like a development, staging, production, then you can create different tenants that you can. So if you wanted to have your application a dev environment, you would just sign up for Auth0 as the dev environment, and then when you wanted to go to production, click create an account, create a new tenant, give it the name like myapp.prod, and then just set up your API keys in that environment so that you kind of separate them, and then you can give your developers access to this platform where they can kind of go wild, try different features out, but that's not going to affect your production environment. And one of the really cool things about Auth0 is you can use all of these features for free up to 7,000 monthly active users. So that, if you're just doing development, if you just want to get started really quickly in implementing identity, you can ride this thing out for free for a very, very long time. And the only limitation there is you can only have 2 active social connections on it once. So you can have like Google and Facebook, but not GitHub, or you can have GitHub and Google, but not Facebook at the same time. And you can mix and match. But for development purposes, I mean, that's usually more than enough. And you can have any number of database connections and anything like that. But that's just a small sales pitch. So if we jump back into our code here, I will. Since I was already logged into GitHub, it did everything for me, and it just sent me back in and authenticated me. And since we don't have anything else in our application at the moment, it's kind of bare bones. But let's make a small adjustment here when we log in, just to log that auth result, just to see what we get back from Auth0. So I'll log back in, and this time let's log in with Facebook. So it's going to log me in, and it gave me an access token that I can use to talk to an API. It gave me an ID token, and it decoded that ID token payload. So it gave me all this information on who my user is. So it has, my name, my given name, gender, a link to my scopes, and basically all information that I granted to my application from Facebook. So I have all this info, and now I know who my user is. So if we wanted to go back into our application and make a small adjustment, let's go into our home component and say, when the user is logged in, let's show them a message saying, actually, we'll just do this. Happy Valentine's Day. And then we'll display the name of the user. So let's go into our home component, add that name property, and we're going to get this name from our user profile, so from Auth0. And actually, I wanted to do this a little bit differently. So I'm just going to copy some code here just to save time. I know we're running a little behind. But for right now, let's just say this. Clicked, and we also need to import our auth service so that we can have access to the user profile. And then what we're going to do is we'll add a component here. And let's toggle word wrap. So if our user is logged in, and if they click the get message button, we're going to display them a happy Valentine's Day and then show their name. And then we're only going to display this if they have clicked that message. So right now, if we go back into our application, let's log in. And this time, I'll just log in with the username and password. So I'm authenticated, and now that I am logged in, I get the get your secret message button. So if I were to hit that, now I get a message saying Happy Valentine's Day. And since this user account, I'm using a username and password connection, I haven't given them my full name. it's showing my actual name as my email address, so auto@auto.com, and that works fairly well. But this isn't very very romantic. So let's try to change that a little bit. So I'm gonna go ahead and create a couple of new components in our application here. So let's go into our command and let's create a cheesy Valentine's Day greeting. So let's generate a new component and call it cheesy. And I'm using the Angular CLI here.
You laugh so much, Otto.
And so running the ngGenerate component command from the Angular CLI and giving it a name is going to do all of the kind of heavy lifting for us in creating the HTML, the TypeScript file, and probably the biggest time saver for me, which is what I always forget to do, is actually adding that component in app.module. So using the CLI, it automatically adds it for me so that I don't have to see all that red saying, hey, this component doesn't exist, it's not registered. So I absolutely love using the CLI for that reason alone. And so now we have this cheesy component and we have the HTML, the TypeScript for it. Let's use this component, or actually let's just load it into our application. And for right now, we're not going to have to be logged in. We're just going to see the cheesy works. So whether you're logged in or not, we're going to display this cheesy works. And since I'm not much of a great designer, I went on CodePen last night and found a couple of really awesome designers and developers that do some really awesome, cool things. So I just borrowed some of their code, and I will copy and paste it here to show you guys some of the cool stuff that they've done. So this is going to be our first component. And I am just going to copy some of their awesome CSS as well. And in the slides, I'm going to link to this content as well so that you can take a look at it. But for right now, if we go back into our application, you're going to see this cool component, and we're going to go ahead and edit this so that you'll have to be logged in to see it. But this is going to be our cheesy message. So if you get this message and if you send this message to your Valentine, once they log in, they're going to get a message saying you're the HTML to my CSS. So that's our first component.
This is so great.
This is awesome.
We need this for Mike and Brandon, really.
So let's go ahead and add a couple more. So let's say generate component, and this one is going to be, let's call this one pixel. And again, I'm using the Angular CLI just to speed things up. And this one is also pretty awesome. So let's copy the HTML. Let's put some styling. And now let's go into our home component. And instead of showing the cheesy message, we'll say show pixel. And if you're curious where we get these component names from, they're registered in the TypeScript file. So again, the Angular CLI does this for us. It just depends our app name prefix, which is just the default of app, and then the component name that we gave it, pixel. So now if we go back into our application, we get the message that you're pixel perfect. And this one was made by Alex Safayan. Sorry for butchering that name. But this is going to be our second message that your Valentine can get. And let's add a third one, which is probably my favorite. So let's generate a new component. And we'll call this one secret.
I didn't even realize when you said you were going to do a special Valentine's themed like demo. I didn't. This is so great, Otto.
Well, thank you. So this one I'm super excited to show off. So let's go and open up our secret. Where are you? Here you are. And let's add the CSS for that one. And go into our home component. Let me close a couple of these. Home component HTML. And let's load up our secret component. And now the message that you get is a Pikachu that says, "Will you be my Valentine?"
This is so great.
So now we have these three, lovely messages that we can send to our Valentine. Let's see how we're actually going to apply those in, kind of mixing identity into that.
I think you might have just knocked Otto or Uri out of first place for most romantic nerd.
So let's go into here, and now let's add some Angular decorators or Angular. What are they called? Structured directives that'll kind of show these components based on who the user is and what message that they get. So a cool way we can do that is I'm just gonna again just copy some content just to save time. And I renamed this one to secret. So we have a couple of different, so we're loading up our three different components, pixel, cheesy, and secret, based on our Valentine message. So it's either going to be 0, 1, or 2, and it's only going to be displayed once your Valentine clicks on the get message button. So we have to add this Valentine feature. So in our home component, let's also add Valentine, and then here we'll say this dot Valentine comes from our auth profile message component. Now, when we are authenticated and we go in and log in, and I'll just log in with my already registered account. Uh-oh. What is going on? Failed with a 429. Let's log in with Facebook. Okay, that was weird. So now that we're logged in, we can click our get your secret message. And by default, we still get that happy Valentine's Day. And now since I'm logged in with Facebook, I get my name, but we don't get any of those cool components that we created. And the reason for that is because our user profile does not have any information relating to that message component. So if you look at our payload, we have all of this information on our user, but we don't have a message. And one thing we can do is go into our users in the dashboard. So here's the Facebook connection, and we can add a metadata saying that, your message is going to be, 2, for example. And if we save that, whoops, has to be valid JSON. So message, save. So now if we go back in, we'll log in, get our new access token, and now we'll get the message. Let me scroll down a little bit. Will you be my Valentine? Because in our payload now, in our ID token, in our user identifier, we added the additional property of message. So now our Angular application can look at that from the authorization server, get our message, and then show the correct one. But that's not, we can do it that way, but it might be kind of tedious to go into the dashboard every single time. So one thing we can do is add an auth0 rule that automatically assigns a message once a user is created. And auth0 rules are basically context-aware serverless functions that run anytime your application is, anytime a user authenticates. So what auth0 by default does is it verifies the user's identity and it issues tokens. And in between that, you have a whole pipeline of rules and hooks and other functions you can run to kind of, add user information, get additional user information, do multi-factor, any sort of additional identity related items you can do in that pipeline. So the one thing we're going to do here is whenever a user logs in, we're going to generate a random message. So a random number from 0 to 2, appended to our user metadata in the message field, and then just save it and then log that user in. So by default, we now have that rule turned on. If we go back in, I'll log out and I'll log back in. And this time we might get a different one. We might get the same one. Let's see. Okay, so now we got your pixel perfect because our message was changed to message 0. So every time our Valentine logs in now, they might get a different message. And the last thing I wanted to show off is if you wanted to create this app and only allow a specific user to log in. So right now, I can log in with any account. So I can go in and log in with Google, for example, and log in with my work email. And that still works. I'm going to get a random message and it works perfectly. But since Valentine's Day is more personal, you might want to whitelist it to only specific users. So let's turn on this rule called email domain whitelist and only enable your specific Valentine to log in. So in this example, I'm just allowing a user with the email address of kukicadmin@gmail.com to log in. And if the user logging in, and they can be coming from a social connection like Google or Facebook, since we get their email, we're going to know who that user is. So if their email address field is this one, we're going to log them in. If it's any other email address, then we're going to send them an error saying, sorry, this message was not meant for you, and we're not going to log them in. So that rule is turned on. Let's take a quick example. Let's quickly see how that works. So I'm going to log out and I'll log in. And this time I'll just log in with the email address that I'm expected, which should work just fine. And it does. So I get my message. But if I were to try to log in with a different email address, say Google and say my work email address, which is different, I'm not going to be logged in and I'm going to get an error here saying I'm unauthorized and the message, I'm sorry, this message wasn't meant for you. So I don't even get the option of seeing that message. And, this rule might be used if you, for example, didn't want people signing up to your application from, free domains from like Gmail, Yahoo. You just wanted them to use their work domain to sign in, or, you had a different whitelist of users that you wanted to whitelist to be able to log in and block everybody else. So that's kind of rules, and that's just a brief overview and brief introduction in how that works. And I think that's everything I had for the demo. Do you guys have any questions so far?
I think this was, as someone who's done off the long way, this demo has been like so easy to follow. I don't think there have been any questions, but normally I say that's bad, but I think in this case it's good because this was a really great demo.
Awesome.
So I think it's just, we just were able to follow you. Okay, so if you guys watching online have any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat. Otherwise, Javi, Jesse, do you guys have questions? I think we were kind of jumping in and asking questions along the way. So
cool. Okay, so while you guys collect any questions from the viewers, I'm going to quickly go over the best current practice for single page applications, securing them. So right now in our demo here, we did use the implicit flow, but there is a new and up and coming flow called, well, it's not a new flow for OAuth, but it is a new flow for single page applications called authorization code with PKCE. And what PKC stands for is proof key for code exchange. And very quickly running through how this works is, our baseline is still the same. You have a single page application that makes requests to an API. You get JSON data back. Your Angular application decides how to process it. When you go to authenticate, this is where it gets just a little bit different. So when you click on that login button to log in, what your server is going to send in addition to your user information for logging in is a code challenge. And the way that this code challenge works is you're going to use the browser's native crypto functionality to generate a SHA-256, for example, hash of a random string of characters. So you might say, you might have a message of, just a random word, say, Valentine. You run it through SHA-256, you get that hash, and you send it with your authentication request. Your authorization server, when it logs in the user, it's going to take that hash and store it on the server side, on the authorization server, and say, okay, I'm going to keep this, and I'm going to wait. I'm going to ask you for this later. And then instead of sending you your tokens directly over in the query string parameters, it's just going to send you a random query string, a random code, and it's just going to be a random string of, a couple of characters and numbers. And at this point, what your Angular application is going to do is it's going to, in that callback component, it's going to say, hey, I got this code. Let's make sure that this user is logged in. And it's going to send that code back to the authorization server. And now to verify that code challenge, it's going to send the unhashed string. So if your hash string was Valentine, yeah, it's just going to send the string Valentine to the authorization server. The authorization server is going to verify that the code is valid for the authorization request, and that the code verifier that unhashed hash is correct. And if both of those elements are correct, then it's going to send you your access tokens and your ID tokens in a post message request. So it's not going to append your tokens in the query strings in the URL. It's going to send them in a post data message. And at that point, you're going to have your JSON, your access tokens, your ID tokens in your Angular application, and the rest of the flow and silent authentication and everything else works exactly the same. So the only difference there is, instead of you getting the access tokens directly, you have this additional code that you get back, and the code challenge and code verifier using the browser's crypto functionality. And then to quickly summarize that this authorization code with Pixie is the current best practice, and Auth0 is currently updating their APIs to support this, and so are all the other kind of players in the industry. So from a developer standpoint, you're not going to have to do anything extra. You're still just going to call that authorize or login method that's going to do all this stuff behind the scenes for you. So you're not going to be exposed to it. You don't care about it. But for a security developer or for an identity developer, it kind of matters which code you use. But if you're okay with the implicit flow, and many companies are have been using it for the last 5-6 years, and they're going to continue using it, and as long as you understand that attack surface, that you're exposing the access tokens in the URL, so if you have any sort of logging, they might be exposed through that mechanism. And if you understand those risks and you're okay with them, there's absolutely no need to mitigate to authorization code with Pixie. Auth0 is going to, support that, and we're going to implement the best current practice. But if you are using implicit flow and you're not using Auth0, there is no immediate rush or hurry to change it. And then never ever store your access tokens in the browser in local storage. Just kind of wanted to reiterate that. A couple of additional resources. If you want a more in-depth Angular authentication tutorial, we have one that was originally written by me, and then Kim actually did a great job in updating it to the latest Angular version. So you could check that out at the bit.ly ngAuth quick tutorial. If you want to learn more about OAuth, all the different grant types, flows, the OAuth complete guide, and then we didn't talk too much about scopes, but if you want to understand more about OAuth 2.0 scopes, I have that article there written by another one of our principal architects at Auth0. And that's really all I had for the slides. Thank you, guys. And a special thanks to the CodePen users that created those really awesome Valentines themed projects that I was able to borrow for this presentation. So any more questions? Otherwise, I think we can, I know we're running a little over.
That was worth it, totally worth it. You could turn off your screen share if you want to.
Sweet.
And so I think you picked up a few new customers. Justin and Anthony in the chat said they were going to be checking this out and possibly using Auth0 from now on. I love Auth0 because the documentation is super easy to follow. And obviously you guys are like hiring up all my favorite people. So there's another you and Jesse. But yeah, I think this is great. I really appreciate you coming on and doing this for us. And
sure. Thank you for having me.
Jesse, Javi, you guys have any more questions?
No, I think that was great. That was a really great presentation. I guess the one question that does come up is the Pixie piece. What is the advantage for that? If it's not jumping out, like it's not jumping out to me about why I would do that and choose that over just traditional. So what additional, I'm guessing here it's because additional layer of security, but what does this help defeat?
Sure. So one of the big things that it helps defeat is token leakage. So for example, if you were using the implicit flow and you got the access token in the URL hash fragment, if you have any sort of like Google Analytics running, or if you have any type of logging, then those access tokens could end up in your logs. It could end up in Google Analytics. It could also end up in the user's browser history, so that a malicious actor could potentially get access to those access tokens and impersonate the user and kind of call the API without logging in or without authenticating. What Pixie does is the authorization code with Pixie Flow, it never sends the tokens over in the URL fragment. So you never get the token via the URL. So it's never going to show up in any of the logs. And the code challenge and code verifier ensure that there's no man in the middle attack. Or so Pixie was traditionally used in desktop and native applications where they were still public clients, and they could be easily intercepted, where a malicious actor could in the middle intercepted the code, exchange it for the tokens, and kind of impersonate your user. Pixie eliminates that because the token challenge and verifier are created within the application, within the browser, and only that browser knows what the challenge and the verifier is. So you get kind of that benefit, and then finally, you get your tokens in the post request from that code exchange. So they're never exposed to the browser; they're only within the application.
Great, thanks. That's a great explanation.
And it was a great demo. I really liked the artwork, and I appreciate you going the extra mile to get that put together for us. That was awesome. Anthony wants to know where he can find the links that you showed.
So I haven't published them yet. Let me just give me a couple hours to get them up and running, and I will share them in the ngHouston group as well as the meetup page.
Okay, so if you follow ngHouston on Twitter, which is ng_Houston on Twitter, then Otto can just tweet it and we'll retweet it. And also, Otto, your Twitter handle is your last name followed by your first name.
Yep.
And the spelling is right down below. So it's Kukic, Kukic, and then Otto, ADO.
Yep.
Thank you so much again for coming on. This was super fun. And okay, so next week, I don't think we have an episode lined up. The week after that, we have Dan Muller from the Narwhal team coming to show us some really cool stuff. The week after that, we have a week off. And then we have coming, I just had this date in here, and it's a good thing. March 13th, we have Jesse Sanders.
Who?
Jesse, put it on your calendar. Don't forget, you're in the hot seat.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a great episode.
Going to drop some knowledge on us.
All right.
Awesome. Looking forward to that one.
For sure. Okay. Thanks, everybody, again. And we'll see y'all soon.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Otto.